Ethan Cole was the kind of man whose name carried weight in every corporate boardroom across the country. At 38 years old, he was already a billionaire, founder and CEO of one of the world's most innovative tech companies. His sharp mind and uncompromising business tactics had turned him into a legend in the financial world. The media called him the Ice King, a nickname that both fascinated and intimidated people. He rarely smiled in public, and when he did, it looked rehearsed, like a habit rather than a feeling. From the outside, Ethan had everything. He lived in sprawling penthouses overlooking city skylines, owned private jets that could take him anywhere in the world in a matter of hours, and had a collection of luxury cars most people only saw in magazines. His phone never stopped ringing. Investors, politicians, journalists, everyone wanted a piece of his time. But what none of them knew was that behind the flawless suits and confident posture was a man who felt empty. It wasn't that Ethan didn't enjoy success. He had worked too hard to pretend it meant nothing. But after years of non-stop deals, endless negotiations and strategic battles, he had built walls so high that no one could climb them. Friendships faded because he was too busy. Relationships ended because women grew tired of being second to his career. Even his own family had learned to keep their distance, only calling when they needed something. And Ethan? He told himself this was fine. Better to be alone than to be distracted. But in the quiet moments, when the day's chaos had settled and the city lights blinked outside his window, he felt it, the weight of isolation pressing against his chest. It was a strange kind of loneliness, one that money couldn't solve. The truth was, he couldn't remember the last time someone had hugged him, without an agenda. That night, the rain was relentless. It poured in thick sheets, drumming against the tinted windows of Ethan's sleek black sedan, as he left yet another exhausting meeting with overseas partners. His driver wasn't with him. He'd insisted on driving himself, claiming he needed thinking time, though he wasn't sure why. His mind felt clouded, tired. Then, just a few blocks from the city center, the car gave a sudden, sharp jolt. The dashboard lights flickered, and the engine sputtered like it was gasping for air. Ethan cursed under his breath, steering the vehicle to the side of a quiet street lined with closed shops and flickering street lamps. He tried the ignition twice. Nothing. For a moment he just sat there, listening to the rain. He could have called for one of his assistants or summoned a ride from one of his drivers, but something in him hesitated. Instead, he reached for his umbrella and stepped out into the storm. The rain was cold, soaking his tailored coat within seconds, but the sensation was oddly grounding. The streets were nearly empty, the only sounds being the patter of rain and the distant hum of traffic. He began walking, his polished shoes splashing in shallow puddles, each step taking him deeper into a part of town he hadn't seen in years. Storefronts here weren't made of gleaming glass and steel. They were old, worn, their signs faded from years of sun and rain. The street smelled faintly of wet concrete and coffee from a small cafe that was still open, its warm light spilling onto the sidewalk. Ethan didn't know it yet, but with every step he took away from his broken-down car, he was walking towards something that would break the monotony of his carefully controlled life. Something unscripted, something real. And on that rain-slicked street, in the quiet part of town, fate was waiting for him, small, fragile, and in desperate need of the one thing Ethan hadn't given anyone in years: a moment of genuine human connection. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle by the time Ethan turned down a narrower street. Streetlights glowed faintly in the mist, their light catching the falling droplets like tiny floating crystals. He adjusted his umbrella, trying to shield himself from the cold, when something in the corner of his vision made him pause. There, on a worn wooden bench beneath a swaying street lamp, sat a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Her knees were pulled up to her chest, and her thin arms wrapped tightly around them as though she were trying to make herself smaller. Her dark hair clung damply to her face, and her shoes were soaked through. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the way she shivered. He almost kept walking. His mind instantly supplied the usual logic. It's none of my business. Someone else will help. I'm not good at this. But then she lifted her head just enough for their eyes to meet, and something inside him froze. Her eyes weren't just sad. They were tired, the kind of tired no child should know. Ethan found himself walking toward her before his brain could talk him out of it. "Hey," he said softly, stopping a few feet away so as not to scare her. "Are you lost?" She shook her head.
No.
"Are you waiting for someone?" he asked, scanning the street for any sign of an adult. Again, she gave a small shake of her head. Then, after a pause, she looked at him and whispered, "I just need a hug. Can I hug you?" The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. Of all the things she could have asked, a coin, some food, directions, she wanted a hug. For a man who spent years avoiding emotional closeness, the request felt disarming. He stood there for a second, torn between discomfort and an inexplicable pull toward her. Finally, he crouched down so he was at her level. "A hug?" he repeated, as though making sure he'd heard right. She nodded, her eyes glistening. Something about her vulnerability, so raw, so unfiltered, bypassed every defense he'd built over the years. Without thinking too much, Ethan opened his arms. She moved quickly, like she'd been holding herself back and couldn't anymore. Her small arms wrapped tightly around him, her face pressing into the fabric of his coat. The embrace was warm and desperate, as if she was afraid he'd disappear if she let go too soon. Ethan felt something in his chest crack open, an ache he hadn't acknowledged in years. They stayed like that for a while, the rain whispering against the umbrella above them. Finally, she stepped back and wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "My name's Lily," she said, her voice soft. "Ethan," he replied, though he doubted she knew or cared who he was. She explained that her mother worked late shifts at a nearby diner and usually picked her up, but tonight she was running behind. She liked sitting on the bench because she could see the diner sign from there, and it made her feel safe. Ethan listened quietly, nodding now and then, surprised by how easily the conversation flowed. Normally, small talk felt exhausting to him, but with Lily it was different. It was simple. Minutes later, the sound of hurried footsteps came from the direction of the diner. A woman in a faded jacket appeared, her face lined with worry. "Lily," she called, rushing toward them. She knelt down, wrapping her arms around her daughter, then looked up at Ethan with suspicion. "Who are you?" Ethan stood and introduced himself politely, explaining that he'd just kept her company until she arrived. The woman's expression softened slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice edged with both gratitude and exhaustion. She explained that things had been tough since her husband passed away 2 years ago, but she was doing her best to make ends meet. As mother and daughter walked away together, Ethan watched them disappear into the mist. The warmth of Lily's hug still lingered in his chest. He didn't know why it mattered so much, but it did. And for the first time in years, Ethan found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, he'd been missing something far more important than the next big deal. That night, Ethan barely slept. He lay in bed, staring at the high ceiling of his penthouse, the rain still echoing faintly in his mind. But it wasn't the weather keeping him awake. It was that hug. He'd shaken hands with presidents, sealed multimillion-dollar deals with powerful CEOs, and attended galas surrounded by the world's elite. Yet, none of those moments had left an imprint like Lily's small arms around him. It was such a simple act, but it carried a weight he couldn't explain. For the first time in years, someone had touched him without expecting anything in return. Not money, not influence, not opportunity. Just warmth. The next morning, Ethan found himself distracted at work. His assistant noticed he was unusually quiet during meetings, almost absent-minded. He caught himself wondering if Lily was at school, if her mother had managed to get enough rest after the late shift, if they had a warm meal waiting for them at home. These weren't the kind of thoughts he was used to having. His mind usually revolved around profit margins, mergers, and strategic expansions. But now, numbers felt strangely hollow. By mid-afternoon, he did something impulsive. He canceled his afternoon schedule, told his driver to take him back to that part of town, and found himself standing in front of the same small cafe he'd passed the night before. Through the fogged-up window, he could see the glow of the diner Lily had mentioned. He wasn't sure why he was there. He didn't even have a plan. But something inside him told him to wait. It didn't take long. Around 4 p.m., Lily came skipping out of the diner, her school bag bouncing against her back. When she spotted him, her face lit up in a way Ethan wasn't used to seeing. "Ethan!" she called, running toward him. He smiled, really smiled this time, and knelt down to greet her. "Hey, Lily. How was school?" They spent the next hour talking at the cafe. She told him about her favorite subject, art, her least favorite, math, and how she wanted to be someone who makes the world prettier when she grew up. He listened, genuinely interested, sipping his coffee as she rambled on with childlike enthusiasm. When her mother arrived to pick her up, she was surprised and a little wary to see Ethan again. But after hearing how he'd simply kept her daughter company, she offered him a small smile. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I wanted to," he replied, and he meant it. Over the next few weeks, Ethan visited more often. Sometimes he'd drop by the cafe to see Lily, sometimes he'd help her mother carry groceries, and other times he'd just sit at the diner, ordering coffee he barely touched while he read the newspaper. Slowly, the three of them grew more comfortable around each other. Ethan learned things he'd never known about the world outside his high-rise bubble. The cost of keeping the lights on, the struggle of balancing work with raising a child alone, the way small kindnesses could make a day easier. One evening, as he was about to leave, Lily tugged at his coat. "You're different," she said matter-of-factly. He chuckled. "Different how?" "You smile more now," she answered, grinning. Her words stayed with him long after he drove away. She was right. Something in him had shifted, and it all began with that first hug. A hug that had broken down walls he didn't even know were still standing. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't just feel alive, he felt connected. And deep down, he knew he didn't want to go back to the man he had been before that rainy night. Ethan had always believed charity was a transaction, something rich people did at black tie events so their names could be printed in glossy magazines. But now it felt different. This wasn't about reputation or tax breaks. It was personal. In the weeks after meeting Lily, he began to notice the small cracks in the world around her. Things most people ignored. The flickering light outside the diner that her mother couldn't afford to fix. The worn soles on Lily's shoes. The fact that Lily's art projects were always drawn on scraps of paper because her school couldn't afford proper supplies. These were tiny details, but to Ethan, they were neon signs flashing "Help is needed here." At first, he acted quietly. He anonymously paid for the diner's repairs so the sign outside would glow again, making the place safer at night. He left an envelope with art supplies at the cafe for Lily, pretending they were from someone who believed in her dreams. He even arranged for a local grocery store to send fresh produce to their apartment once a week, always under the guise of a community program, so they wouldn't feel indebted. But as much as he wanted to remain invisible, Ethan realized something. Helping people without being seen was noble, but being present, really present, was powerful in a different way. It built trust. It built connection. One Saturday afternoon, he knocked on Lily's apartment door with a small cardboard box in his arms. Her mother, Sarah, opened the door, looking both surprised and slightly suspicious. "I thought you might need this," Ethan said, holding the box out. Inside were things Sarah hadn't bought in years. Warm winter coats for both her and Lily, new shoes, a grocery voucher, and a small stack of books for Lily's schoolwork. "I can't accept this," Sarah said immediately, her pride flashing in her voice. "You can," Ethan replied calmly. "And you don't owe me anything. This isn't a favor. It's just something I want to do." Sarah hesitated, glancing at Lily, who was already leafing through the books with wide eyes. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders softening. "Thank you." From that day forward, their interactions changed. Sarah no longer looked at Ethan like he was a stranger who might disappear at any moment. She started offering him coffee when he visited, telling him small stories about her day, even laughing sometimes. And Lily? She became the little spark in Ethan's otherwise gray world. She'd draw him silly pictures, tell him about her friends at school, and sometimes just sit quietly beside him, as if his presence alone was enough. But it wasn't only their lives that were changing, Ethan was changing too. At work, his staff noticed he was less impatient, more approachable. He started asking about their families instead of jumping straight to business. His assistant even joked, "Who are you and what have you done with Mr. Cole?" Ethan knew the answer, though he never said it out loud. The walls around his heart were crumbling, brick by brick. He was rediscovering the simple truth he had ignored for years. Money could build skyscrapers, but it could never build the kind of warmth he felt sitting in Sarah's kitchen, sipping coffee while Lily colored at the table. One evening, as he walked back to his car after visiting them, Ethan caught his reflection in a shop window. He was smiling without realizing it. Not the practiced, polite smile he wore for investors, but a real one, the kind that came from somewhere deep inside. And it all began with a hug from a little girl on a rainy night. Months passed, and the winter snow began to melt into the first signs of spring. Ethan's life looked the same on paper. Still the billionaire CEO, still in the headlines, still making high-stakes decisions, but inside he was a different man. The changes were subtle to outsiders. He laughed more in meetings. He started remembering people's names, even the security guards and office cleaners. He no longer rushed through conversations, and when someone shared a personal struggle, he actually listened. The man who once lived only for the next big deal now found himself leaving the office early just to have dinner at a small apartment with a single mother and her little girl. That March, Sarah invited Ethan to a local charity event at Lily's school. The fundraiser was small, held in the gymnasium with folding chairs and homemade decorations, but it was buzzing with life. Children ran around with paper crafts, parents chatted over baked goods, and music played softly from a corner speaker. Ethan had attended hundreds of high-profile galas in his life, but this felt different. It was warm, unpolished, and real. When Lily spotted him across the room, she dropped the cupcake she was holding, much to Sarah's dismay, and ran toward him at full speed. "Ethan!" she squealed, launching herself into his arms. Her hug was just as tight as the first one, only now it came with a giggle instead of tears. "You came," she said, smiling up at him. "Of course," Ethan replied. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The evening was simple but perfect. They watched Lily's art project win first place, shared slices of homemade pie, and laughed at the school principal's corny jokes during the raffle. At one point, Ethan caught Sarah watching him, a soft gratitude in her eyes that didn't need words. She knew, just as he did, that their lives had been changed by something as small and as powerful as kindness. Later, as the night wound down, Lily tugged on Ethan's sleeve. "You're smiling again," she said, her tone almost serious. He raised an eyebrow. "Again." She nodded. "You used to look, I don't know, lonely, but now you look happy." Ethan's chest tightened, but in a good way. "I am happy," he admitted, "and you're a big reason why." Lily grinned, clearly pleased with herself, before darting off to join her friends. Ethan stood there for a moment, taking in the scene, the laughter, the chatter, the warmth. It was a world he hadn't been part of in years, and yet it felt like he belonged. Driving home that night, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. All the boardrooms, the flights, the luxury. None of it had ever given him this feeling. True wealth, he realized, had nothing to do with the size of his bank account. It was in the connections he made, the lives he touched, and the moments, like that first rainy night hug, that reminded him of his own humanity. From that day forward, Ethan made a promise to himself. No matter how busy, no matter how successful, he would always make time for the people who truly mattered. Because the billionaire who once lived in a glass tower, looking down at the world, had finally stepped down and found something far more valuable than gold.